for being here today. I know from personal experience how awkward it is when someone mispronounces your name, so I'm going to make sure that I get this right. Llena Chavis. People mispronounce Jonathan all the time. It irks me, but I get over it. Today's lecture is an outgrowth of the Continuum Scholars Program. Last summer, this group of scholars received funding designed to expand the conversation at Hope College around issues of faith, vocation, and scholarship. An interdivisional cohort of 5 pre-tenure faculty members met throughout the summer to discuss theological perspectives on the vocation of scholarship, the current state of theological reflection and engagement in their research fields and disciplines, and the ecumenical continuum of theological perspectives through which our colleagues, both at Hope College and within higher education, approach their own scholarship. Our collective goal is to build a community committed to an ongoing conversation about faith, vocation, and scholarship. We're glad, that by being here today, you too are part of that community and that conversation. Now I want to take a moment to introduce today's speaker. One of the things we asked our folks to do this summer is they wrote vocational biographies. And Llena blessed the one that I'm about to read you. So it has her approval. These are her words. I've merely changed it to the third person, so it's not weird, because I'm not her. Born and raised on the south side of Chicago, Llena Chavis came to Hope College in 1996, feeling called by the power of her mother's demand to decline her swimming scholarship to what her mother referred to as a party school. Beginning at Hope as what Llena would describe as an angry at religion agnostic, she finally graduated with a double major in social work and psychology as a confused new Christian and engaged to her now husband. Llena happily worked with the adult and adolescent mentally ill population for 5 years, loved clinical work, and loved the mentally ill population. She truly felt that she had found her place in the world until her family moved to Kentucky for her husband's job. Sadly, at this point, her career choice was based strictly on a practical decision. What would make money to support their growing family, rather than any vocational dream? Conveniently, there was a teaching job in the social work department at the very school where Llena's husband was employed. This led to her new career as a professor, and Llena's pursuit of a PhD began, still allowing her to maintain clinical practice on the side. She struck a professional balance that she never knew could exist and felt that perhaps she had now arrived. 3 kids later and a growing belly with her 4th found Llena content, but her husband had become disgruntled in his career and requested a change. Thus began his stint as a student / stay-at-home dad, and in 2011 he requested to move the family, quote, somewhere he could have a variety of options to pursue a second higher degree. Sadly but willingly, Llena began searching to move yet again and ended up with 3 choices, Hope being one of the 3. This time, as she came back to where it all began, she recognized and embraced God as a part of every moment of her journey. And as much as Llena feels herself starting to be settled into this new life, she also recognizes that God may not be done with her vocational journey. However, this time, Llena is open to whatever is next. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Llena Chavis.
Well, thank you. I probably should have put more intention behind my vocational journey since I hate talking in front of people. And that's kind of a part of this. First I think as we're looking at this title, I feel like it's an eclectic ball of jumbled. And I think it's important to sort of outline this conflict that I think there is. We tell students when they come to our majors, you can do all these great things. You can work in hospitals, you can work as a social worker in a mental health agency, you can go and you can do all these great things in schools. You don't have to know now what you're doing. You can explore this. This is an open-ended journey for you. And then we tell them they can work with individuals or groups or communities or in policies. They can work on micro, meso, or macro systems. It doesn't matter what they want right now. They don't have to know. And then as we go up in our journey and we become PhD professors, here we are, and then they're like, what do you want to study? What is your research interest? And this, to me, as a social worker, felt really out of the box for me, and I didn't really know what to do with this. So when I came into academia and did finally complete my PhD after many years of commuting and stress, this is kind of how I think about this. So as a clinician, I was very interested in mental health. I was very interested in the human condition and what makes people work and how people work in their worlds well. And I was interested in specifically the idea of self-efficacy, which I will define in a little bit and talk about a little bit more in a minute. But at the time of my PhD journey, he mentioned I had kids. At the time that I started my PhD, I had one, and I had just given birth, and I had a 3-month-old as I was commuting my first day to class, 2.5 hours. And I was driving, I had just left the baby, and I had my breast pump sitting next to me, and I was sitting behind the wheel, and I was like, what in God's name am I doing? And I burst out in tears, and I cried the whole way to my first day of class. And then we got into class, and the professor said, okay, everyone, what do you think you might want to write a dissertation on? And I was like, I don't know, my baby's at home, I don't know what I want to do. And so I just raised my hand and I said, mothering, anxiety, that's what I want to write my dissertation on. So it wasn't exactly a randomly chosen topic, but I did end up writing my dissertation on mothering and anxiety. So it did stick, although it took me 7 years to get to that point. But as the years went and my children grew and I started looking at children and at-risk children and what happens in the world around them and how children make it or don't fall through the cracks, my research interests kind of started morphing. And what it became was this, right? I became interested in mothering and mentoring and now sex trafficking and took this weird detour this summer. So, but I think I would qualify all this and say I'm interested in wellness. I'm interested in how human beings work well. Don, I just saw you. Work well in the world. So, my first study, and I am going to start with my beloved, blessed dissertation. I'm recovering from that now. And I'll talk about it without crying. So, I looked at 116 moms and didn't get a very versatile sample. It was pretty homogeneous. Lots of white, married, working moms. And actually, when I looked at the demographics, I was like, oh, this is going to be a really bad study. Everyone's going to be really well adjusted. They're all married. They've all got a pretty decent income. I'm probably going to have something that doesn't tell me much. But interestingly, I did not. They were all raging with anxiety. So this was interesting to me because even though I had this really homogeneous sample, a lot of them, 60.5% of them said they felt nervous on edge. 63.9% of them said they worry most of the time. And 65.9% said they were easily annoyed or irritable. So as a social worker, I wonder what this is about. What can we do when we have a mom with a baby that can alleviate some of this? This is not something we want. We all can agree on this. What can mediate some of this anxiety for them? So I looked at the idea of social support, which made sense to me, right? This moms feel supported, and true to my guess, social support did decrease a mom's anxiety. So the more supported they felt, the less anxious they were. No shocker there. But what was interesting about this result is that perception was a big part of this. So it wasn't just that they were supported. It didn't really actually matter if they were supported. It mattered more that they thought they were supported. They perceived themselves as being supported. But when I looked at the types of support and broke it down, what was interesting is that the significant other or spouse, that support actually wasn't even statistically significant. What mattered more was the social support of friends and family. And when I looked at this and wondered why that was, because of course you would think the spouse would matter more than your friends, common sense, right? But actually it didn't, because it was more about the expectation. So I expect my spouse to be supportive. Congratulations, you helped with your child in the middle of the night. You're supposed to do that, you're the father, right? But when my friend shows up with a meal and holds my baby so that I can go shower, that's huge. That matters more to me. And so the perception of that social support actually didn't show that it was more statistically significant for your friends and family. So we got this, but I was also curious, what was it that was causing the anxiety? I get it, you have a baby, yeah, that's anxiety provoking, but why is that anxiety provoking? What is it about that? And what was interesting is that the moms all said, well, I feel really out of control. It's mostly about things I can't change, or I don't know if I can change, or I don't know what's going to happen, the ifs, which is very commonly what causes anxiety. So the flip side of that is, I can change some things. I can control this. I can predict some of this. So what we know is that when we look at self-efficacy, the more able the mother felt to handle the problems of their child, the more competent they felt around being able to soothe their crying baby, or breastfeed successfully, or manage the stress of their child who is colicky, they are less anxious. So we know that perception matters, we know that social support matters, we know that self-efficacy matters. So I started thinking, okay, from a social work perspective, this is how we think. We think systemically, right? We think that there are different levels, and I would argue psychology thinks this way too. There are different levels of how we, sorry, I didn't mean to be exclusive. But there are different levels of how we view the human condition, and theoretically, the more we put together, the better. We create a synergetic response where the human condition has the best chance. And so what happens if we take both self-efficacy and social support? And sure enough, it did have the lowest level of anxiety. So moms who had the most perceived support, as well as the highest levels of self-efficacy or competence around caring for their child, I look specifically at parenting self-efficacy, had the lowest levels of anxiety. Okay, great. This told me a lot. From a social work perspective, I knew where I wanted to go with this. I wrote this dissertation. Great, all done, graduated. Woo! All right. Then I get here and they're like, okay, so what you gonna study now? And I was like, wait, no, I finished. I'm done. But I wasn't. So I decided to do next. And I was like, you know what, I just want to do something really fun. I want to create this mentoring program, and I want to help kids, and I want to go into this at-risk school. We chose it based on low literacy levels, and we looked at kids who were identified as at-risk by their school social worker. And we recruited college students from home college. So these students are not all social work majors, they're ed majors, they're psych majors, they're social work majors. But actually we didn't qualify their major. We asked them to write an application, and then we interviewed them. And then we matched them with 12 middle school girls who were all identified as at risk. Now these girls had to fit some criteria. They couldn't be violent, they couldn't be physically aggressive, because I didn't want my students to have to deal with that. But that was pretty much it. Any other way that the social worker identified them as at risk would be fine. So we developed this program not at all looking at self-efficacy. We talked about body image, we talked about how to deal with a bully, we talked about healthy communication, we talked about healthy eating, we had an exercise day. It was a 14-week program that ran the length of the semester. And we trained the mentors in the fall and then ran the program in the spring. And then, as we started the program, I thought, you know what, let's look at this. Let's see what this program does. So we looked at the self-efficacy of both the mentors and the mentees. So this was a MITS method. We kind of looked at, we did a quantitative self-efficacy scale, but then we also asked them the question. We asked them to complete the sentence, I see myself as, throughout the course of the program. And although we know that there's history, maturation, and all these things that are a potential here, this really was quite an interesting result. All of the kids increased in their self-efficacy, but even more so did the mentors. Their self-efficacy went up because helping actually improved their self-concept and sense of self. So this is just one of the many qualitative answers. I'll read you some of the other ones. I see myself as a child of God called to help and care for others. I see myself as confident. I see myself as a role model and a positive influence. I see myself as an individual who is kind, loving, and a supportive leader. I see myself as a person who can easily adapt in situations. I see myself in this world as a normal kid that might go through difficult times, but as a person who can get through it. And so to me, this was really a powerful thing. Great, the self-efficacy improves, but more so than that, it's actually impacting how that child is able to set goals and see hope and problem solve their environment outside of the context of this mentoring group, which is ideally what we're shooting for when we're talking about self-efficacy, right? That you're not just doing it here, but you can apply it elsewhere as well. The other part of this that was interesting is that their grades went up. And then the school social worker started reporting these kids aren't coming in and getting in trouble anymore. They're not fighting on the playground. They're not disrupting their classroom. They're actually better citizens within our school environment. And so the context started being generalized for them, right? Their sense of self and their self-concept was being generalized in their environment. So the hazard of some of this is ideally what we want. The desire for change, the goal setting, all of this stuff is being generalized. But part of the risk in this is that we say things like, well, just try harder and you'll be able to get out of your problem, right? Just be happy. Just think positively and you'll be able to create change. But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about self-efficacy. We're talking more about this genuine idea about how you create change in your environment. So let's just kind of qualify this for a second. The belief in one's capabilities to organize and execute the course of action required to manage prospective situations. So in other words, self-efficacy is a person's belief in his or her abilities to succeed in a particular situation. So Bandura talks about these determinants of how people think, behave, and feel, but further, and I didn't put this in the slide, it's not just the sheer intensity of emotional and physical reactions, but rather how they are perceived and interpreted. So if we learn how to minimize stress and elevate mood, that's great, but then we can apply that when dealing with difficult tasks in front of us. So self-efficacy, when we talk about mentoring makes sense, when we talk about mothering makes sense. When we talk about the trafficked victim though, we're not sitting here saying, oh, I want to improve the self-efficacy of the trafficked victim so they can get themselves out of that situation. Well, no, they're not. We already know their self-efficacy is low. We don't need to study that. But what we're wanting to do is figure out how then to help them. So I actually, with a student who's here today, we looked at trafficking last summer together. And Grand Rapids, as you can see, is a little hot spot there. And it's right here. I mean, that's right here. We're dealing with trafficking. And we talked and we met and we talked about what we wanted to look at. And what we became interested in is who are the people that are helping? And what is their self-efficacy like? Because what we learned through the mentoring group, right, is that if we are helping, we actually are becoming more self-efficacious. But why is it, when we look at this, so we're looking at community members, the family, NGO representatives. These people make sense that they're helping. These are just phone calls, so this is not the whole statistic of people that are helping. But theoretically, medical professionals are supposed to be on that list of who's helping. But what we found is that that's not really the case. When we did our research and interviewed people, they're actually not they're not identifying sex trafficked victims, and they're not actually doing anything towards helping. And so we did a series of interviews and we talked to them, and basically what we learned is that they don't feel able to. They don't feel competent in that. A lot of them said, we wouldn't even know what to look for. In fact, I don't know what to do if I did identify somebody as this, and what would be the first step? And so what we found is that the self-efficacy of these medical personnel actually keeps them from helping. So let's sort of let's summarize this. When a person believes that they have previous experience that can inform a current or similar task, they have more confidence around their ability to achieve that task. And the reverse is also true. So if I'm a mom and I feel confident that I can help my child, then, right? And I'm able to translate that to my child. I looked at a lot of moms who said, I babysat my whole life. I didn't go into being a mother at all with any anxiety. And so that experience that they had actually, in turn, resulted in lower levels of anxiety. Mothers who didn't have previous experience, who weren't exposed to lots of babies growing up, had higher levels of anxiety. The second point, self-efficacy can improve an individual's self-perception of capability that then helps them to imagine their goals. When we think about the mentoring group, children who can build self-efficacy can in turn imagine themselves as achieving things outside of this group mentoring program. They can translate that again. And the third point, this influences choices people make in the courses of action they pursue. Again, it actually keeps people from helping if they don't feel that they have high levels of self-efficacy. So none of this is like groundbreaking information. We know that self-efficacy is important in people's desire to help, in people's courage in helping, in people's ability to help well. We know that it improves people's quality of life. We know that self-efficacy is linked to positive psychological well-being. So I'm feeling good about this. I'm writing about this. I was doing research about this. I'm feeling like, okay, this is interesting. How am I going to translate this to my social work profession? I'm talking about it in class. I was feeling good. It arrived, right? And then Jonathan and Karen and Andy came up to me and they were like, hey, you should come talk about your research and how it applies to Christianity. And I was like, no, I don't do that. I don't do research about Christianity. And they were like, yeah, but you're not talking about your research on Christianity. You're talking about how maybe it relates. And I was like, yeah, but it doesn't relate. I don't do that. I do Christianity over here, and I do my research over here. I do my teaching over here. And I had this panic moment. And they were like, no, you can do this. So I was placed with this, like, new question. And I sat in my office for like 30 minutes, and Andy was like, you just have to write this one-page thing. And I sat there literally for 30 minutes, and I just looked at my screen, and I was like, I don't know, I can't. So I Googled, right? That's what we're students. We go to Google, and I typed in self-efficacy and the Bible. Okay? That's what I got. So there are those on the opposite side of the spectrum who see the movement of self-esteem as simply humanism taking over the church. They believe self-esteem is simply pride in another garb. Humility should be promoted, not self-esteem. They feel so strongly against self-esteem, they view those who believe it as works of the devil. So I was like, awesome. So I'm going to tie what I do to the Bible, and then I'm going to talk about it in front of my colleagues. And this is what I find. So I had this little moment of panic, and I ran down to Andy's office, and I was like, yeah, so I can't do this. And he was like, just breathe, you can do this. You research mothers. Mothers are something people care about. So, yeah, so I really started thinking, I talked to Jim, my colleague, I was like, I don't really think I can do this. But after my crisis moment, I refocused, and I was like, okay, we are a value-based profession as social workers. Our entire field is based on a set of 6 core values. Christianity is a value-based religion. So I can do this. That was where I started. I started with our code of ethics. So the National Association of Social Workers says to us, the mission of the social work profession is rooted in a set of core values. These values embraced by the social workers throughout the profession's history. So here are 6 core values. Those matched pretty well with Christianity when I took a second and looked at that and evaluated the idea of service, the idea of helping, the dignity and worth of a person improve. I was like, ooh, that's self-esteem, that's self-efficacy, that's looking at self-concept, the importance of human relationships, competence, all these things started matching up pretty well, at least as I started. So in addition to our code of ethics, our profession has an accreditation process that we go through, and our accrediting body has these competencies that we have to abide by. And because we are at Hope College, we actually have a 11th competency that not other social work programs all have, and it says some of these things. We have to teach how one's own Christian values are motivating a student to select social work. We have to help them understand and recognize one's own Christian value conflict within values in social work. We have to help assess how a colleague's religious traditions inform their understanding of social work practice. And in our competency document, this is written, the central tenet of the Christian faith is to be involved in the restoration of the relationship between people and their God, and the people toward one another and toward their world as Christ served through his model of resolving relationships between people and their environment. So too must the Christian believer. Okay. So when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking, okay, my research doesn't explicitly talk about Christianity. And when I teach, I don't always explicitly talk about Christianity. In fact, I do the opposite. I talk a lot about boundaries. And I talk about how your value system doesn't actually play into what you're doing with your client. And that if your value systems conflict, that's okay. It's not about you. I mean, these are things I'm saying. And so when I'm asked to integrate these things, it's a little bit difficult for me, but what I've come to understand is that despite not actively researching Christian principles, I do feel that Christian work and study of mental health, of safety, of at-risk kids, of mothers, right? All these things matter to Christians and not. And when I'm thinking about my teaching, I always get these 2 questions. One is, can I be a social worker if I'm a conservative? And the other is, what do I do if my client is doing something that I completely disagree with on every level? And when I think about how to teach students this, and how to deal with this sort of Christian principle, and what I'm doing in my research, I kind of go back to this, the idea of human justice. And when I think about my research, and I think about teaching, and I think about students, they feel disconnected to me when I think of them separately. But I've decided to create my own little systems theory of Christian synergy. This is where I'm going with this. And it's a little bit of a stretch, but I thought, you know, what am I doing? How do these things relate? And when they forced me to actually think about it, there was so much overlap. And I looked at the Bible after I stopped Googling, because that wasn't actually helpful. And I came to the Sermon on the Mount, which to me, I was raised by a civil rights activist, so I'm sorry for this reference, but I imagine like power to the people, right? That's what I'm thinking when I read Sermon on the Mount. And And I think about my scholarship, and I think about my teaching, and I think about my students, and I think, what does this mean for me as a Christian scholar, and a Christian teacher, and a Christian person, and a clinician? And I come to the Beatitudes, and I remember Jesus calling us to say, okay, these are the people we're supposed to be working with. These are the people we're supposed to be helping. Even the person who's abusing children is a child of God, actually. And even the person who might be having an abortion is a child of God, actually. And so when I'm helping my students understand this and wrap their heads around this, what I realize what I'm doing is exactly what Karen and Jonathan and Andy did for me this summer, which was to help me understand that being a Christian in your work isn't necessarily about explicitly announcing it as you do it, or being able to read it in your document, but being able to see it in your action and in your work as you're going. And so I was processing this as I was coming to this with the end of trying to get this presentation together. And I said, you know, this is the thing about that Tom Brown quote. We're not talking about self-efficacy in the sense of like, yeah, feel good about yourself, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about self-efficacy for people in the margins. We're talking about self-efficacy for people who are helping people in the margins. We're talking about self-efficacy around how to create the best human condition. In social work, we call this the person and environment fit, right? So we're talking about self-efficacy in the sense where we're helping, and this might, I don't want to say this in the wrong way, but in some ways help in ways the church isn't, right? So I want to leave you with this quote from Matthew, "Let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." Thank you. No questions, right? We're good.
Thank you very much. There was a lot there. There was just a lot there. I have a lot of questions already. But Jonathan, I think, has to duck out to teach. Some of the rest of you may as well. Feel free to do that if you need to. But I know that you're excited to answer a few questions. So who wants to ask the first one? Well, I will, since I have several. Maybe this will get us going. Did you look at all at faith in the mothering or even the mentoring? Is there, was that a part of what you looked at in terms of the support and self-efficacy? Was there
So there was not a faith question in there. There wasn't a single faith question in there, which actually was part of my anxiety, because they kept saying things like, well, but this is social support is, I mean, we know that faith is a part of that and the faith systems, but it was actually very specific to families, friends, significant others, finances. So, no, there wasn't. But in our qualitative study, which wasn't part of what I talked much about, one of the questions was, where do you feel the most support, more open-ended? And many of the moms then identified my church home, my faith.
It's not a question, but just that your talk, Llena, inspired me to think about concepts of self-efficacy, self-esteem, and narcissism, and how they relate or don't to humility versus pride.
Yeah,
Something
which
that
really
you alluded to, and there's an article out just this week, in fact, that differentiates between self-esteem and narcissism. And then self-efficacy is something even different in Bandura's concept. It's kind of your sense of confidence in your ability to do things and accomplish things, which is a little different than self-esteem, which is a little different than narcissism. So maybe for some of those conservative critics,
yeah.
it would
And it
help
was. I
them
mean,
to
he was
differentiate those concepts.
Yeah, hazard of Googling. And for the scale that I used in the mothering was a competence scale, but it was linked to the self-efficacy literature. And for me, when I'm thinking about it biblically, there is actually a lot about, being an image, being God's image, and using God's light, right, to shine through you. And that's not that I want to equate that to self-efficacy, but I do think there's some credence to looking at that. I don't know, I'd be curious to those two things, looking up and thinking about that scripture. But thank you for the questions.
So when you're talking about the medical professions and the sex trafficking, do you then turn around and come up with a program to help them have self-efficacy so that they can?
Yes, so we have developed a module, and Ashley and I are going to be teaching some CEUs to medical personnel at the end of April here at Hope, and and social workers are going to be coming to that, where we'll talk about assessment, we'll talk about intervention, and we'll talk about how to help and what those steps look like. Yeah, thank you for asking.
As I read it and remember, the self-esteem movement of a decade or two ago, I think, fell flat in public schools, mostly because, again, this is my interpretation, I think it wasn't really linked to kind of success outcomes, cognitive resources, strategy. It was feel good about yourself, and then everything else will follow. And I think what I'm seeing here in your mentoring program, for example, is that you've linked resourcing, strategy with this notion. And they really are linked in a if I'm reading it right, they're really linked in a bi-directional way. If you do well in school, you'll start to feel good about your competence to do well in school, and it becomes a positive cycle of life. Sort of interpreting that correctly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You summarized it better than I did. And I think, and that was part of what was interesting to me, because this looking at self-esteem, or self-efficacy in the students, we just use the general self-efficacy scale, was a hindsight thing for me. And so as we were developing the mentoring program, we really weren't even thinking about that. So it was nice to see that correlation, that relationship, even without that intention. It really did, I think, show it even more so. Did you ever imagine that?
Other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Thank you. Calling up. You talk about self-efficacy and of your subjects and of the girls in the program. And you did so in a really winsome way. Thanks for that. I'm wondering though, as you think about your own sense of self-efficacy as a newish professor, having gone through the experience you just went through this last summer with Karen and Andy and Jonathan, like, how did the needle move for you as a
That's
result
a really
of
good
that?
question. I will say I'm more confident specifically on this topic of integrating faith into this. This was not something I ever even slightly considered. I think one of the things that was refreshing to me was the sort of inferiority complex that we all felt. And it was very validating to be in a room full of a bunch of pretending faculty who were all saying this, and who I saw as like brilliant human beings. That was, I think, a very normalizing experience that did help me build a little bit more confidence. And, you know, having people like Karen who are so nurturing and just like, no, you're so awesome all the time helps. But, yeah, it's a really good program.